Eli Whitman was only 8 years old, but he'd been used to doing grown-up things for a long time. That morning, on the edge of Pine Hollow, Michigan, he waded through damp, cold pine needles to gather dry pine cones to bring home to his mother, Brooke Whitman, a 30-year-old woman straining to raise her son on night shifts at a diner and motel rooms that left her hands raw from scrubbing. The woods here were thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that made even breathing feel like a mistake. Then a sound, thin as a thread, cut through the stillness. A groan, faint, broken, as if someone were trying to hold on to life with a last shred of air. Eli stopped short. He should have turned back. He should have pretended he hadn't heard anything, the way people do when they're afraid of trouble. But his feet moved away from safety instead, following that weak sound deeper in, until the tree line opened into a small clearing. And there, Eli saw something that would change his life. A man as big as a boulder was bound tight to a wooden post with rope and iron chains. A black coat smeared with mud and dried blood. A face swollen with bruises. Lips split. Breath heavy. There was no clear cry for help, only the dull, unfocused stare of someone dragged up from hell, still hanging between living and dying. Eli had never seen him before, but he understood one thing immediately. This wasn't an accident. This was an execution, and someone would come back to finish what they'd started. The man tried to open his mouth, and the sound that came out was like torn paper. "Don't call the police." That warning should have sent Eli running straight home to lock the door. But the boy did the opposite. He spun around and bolted through the woods, not to hide, but to find his mother. Because if he walked away, that man would die alone, and Eli Whitman wouldn't accept that. When Brooke opened the door and heard her son stammer about a man dying at the edge of the woods, she only had time to notice one thing in her child's eyes. Not panic, not confusion, but something that had gone hard as steel. Resolve. Brooke understood at once, in the moment she stepped out of the house with Eli, that she wasn't only going to save a stranger. She was walking straight into a world she was never meant to touch. A world that would cling to mother and son like darkness, and wouldn't let go until someone paid the price. If you want to know what an 8-year-old boy and a single mother will do when the underworld starts hunting them, hit like to show your support. Remember to share this story with someone who could use a little more faith in goodness. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next part. Brooke didn't ask anything else, didn't argue anymore. She just snatched the worn-out first aid bag from the kitchen drawer, shoved in an old roll of gauze, a nearly empty bottle of hydrogen peroxide, and the small flashlight she always used while cleaning motel rooms on the night shift, then pulled Eli out of the house, as if one beat of delay would give the dark world she'd just sensed time to tighten its grip around both their throats. The morning was dim. The edge of Pine Hollow still held on to its chill. Wind slid through the pines and left her face numb and stinging, and Eli's old shoes whispered over the wet carpet of needles like crumpled paper. "Hold my hand. You hear me," Brooke said, her voice not loud but hard, her fingers closing around her son's tiny hand so tightly Eli winced. Yet he didn't complain. He only nodded like a small soldier. The narrow path into the woods felt like it was pulling them out of ordinary life, and the deeper they went, the more the town's traffic faded until there was only the occasional drop of birdsong and Brooke's quick, crowded breathing. As she walked, she forced herself to think in the most practical way possible. Stop the bleeding. Call someone. Get the stranger out of here. Then shut the door, lock it, go back to the old life. But with every step, that self-reassurance grew thinner. When they neared the small clearing where Eli had seen the man, Brooke caught a strange smell mixed into the scent of pine resin and damp earth. A faint trace of gasoline, sharp and dirty, like someone had poured it out, and it hadn't had time to evaporate. She stopped short, pulled Eli tight against her, her eyes sweeping the ground, and there the sign spoke louder than any words. Fresh, muddy tire tracks cut deep through the needles, the edges still wet as if the vehicle had left only moments ago. Beside them ran a long drag mark, tangled and heavy, scraping the pine litter aside to reveal black soil underneath, like the trail of a body hauled in, dropped, then yanked again with brutal impatience. Brooke swallowed hard, her stomach clenching. She told herself not to panic. Panic would kill her, and she moved forward anyway. Slower now, steadier, like someone walking on thin ice. The man was still there, hanging heavy on rope and chain, his head slumped, lips split, his chest rising so weakly Brooke had to stare to be sure it wasn't the last breath. Eli tugged her hand and pointed to a section of rope near the base of the wooden post, and Brooke bent down, her heart hammering when she saw that it hadn't snapped from struggling. It had been cut clean, the fibers frayed along a decisive line as if a blade had passed through, and right beside it was a muddy handprint, as though someone had knelt there, rummaged around the captive's belt or coat pocket, searching for something before leaving. "Someone searched him," Brooke whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Eli or to herself, and suddenly she understood something that turned her blood cold. This man hadn't just been abandoned, he'd been hunted. She knelt beside him and opened the first aid bag, her hands shaking but still doing what habit had taught her after too many years of poverty and crisis, wiping the dried blood at his temple, checking the split in his lip, finding what was still seeping so she could press gauze to it. The man stirred. His eyes cracked open to a dull slit and then sagged shut again, but his mouth still fought to push out words like a dry, rasping whisper. "Don't call the police!" At that, Brooke felt cold along her spine, because an innocent person in danger usually begs for help, and someone who's being hunted, yet still fears the police, means the hunters might be standing on the same side as the law. "I'm not calling anyone. I'm just saving you," Brooke answered fast, not knowing if he could hear, but saying it to keep herself from breaking. She pulled the bandage loose and wrapped his wrist where the chain had bitten deep, then looked around for a way to drag him out. And that was the moment the light appeared. Not the gentle light of dawn, but a strip of cold white headlights slicing across the trees like a blade cutting into darkness. Brooke went rigid. Every sound in the woods seemed to stop, leaving only the low, steady hum of an engine somewhere beyond. Then the faint grind of tires on gravel along the path outside. Eli felt his mother's grip clamp tighter. He looked up at her with wide eyes that didn't cry but held 100 questions. And Brooke knew at once they didn't have time to do things the right way, didn't have time to wait for anyone, because someone was already coming. She looked at the dying man, looked at the tire tracks still wet, looked at the rope that had been cut, looked at the headlights sweeping back again as if checking their target, and in one heartbeat, Brooke had to choose between a mother's instinct to grab her child and run, and the part of her conscience Eli had just awakened by coming back for her. "Eli, look at me," she said softly, sharp as an order. "If I tell you to run, you run straight to the main road. Don't look back. Do you understand?" Eli swallowed and nodded, his throat small but still producing a "yes, ma'am" that sounded like a vow. Brooke drew in one deep breath, then bent down and slid her shoulder under the man's dead weight of an arm, trying to lift him away from the post even though her back felt like it might snap, because if she ran, he'd die, and if she stayed, all three of them would die. And Brooke understood the only way to save her child and save this man was to move him now, before the headlights swept the clearing one more time. Brooke clenched her teeth and threw all her strength into yanking the man sideways off the wooden post, but his body was heavy as if the whole forest were pressing him down. Her shoulder felt like it was tearing apart. Her breath slammed back up her throat in a burning rush, and every time she managed to lift him even an inch, the rope tightened with a sharp creak, as if it wanted to keep him there and let him die where he hung. Eli stood close beside her, both hands trembling around the flashlight as he aimed it where she'd pointed, the beam wobbling across leaf litter and tree trunks, making everything look like it was moving even though the wind wasn't any stronger than before. "Keep it low. Don't sweep it around," Brooke whispered, and her voice barely sounded like her own anymore. It sounded like the voice of someone trying to stay alive through the most important minutes of her life. She pulled the small knife from the first aid bag, the blade duller than she wanted, but sharp enough to saw at the rope across the man's chest, fibers snapping loose, scraping her fingers with a cold sting, and the faint gasoline smell seemed to thicken as she leaned in, like someone had just passed through and left their mark on the air. The man twitched, a wet, rasping breath pushing out, his eyes cracking open to a narrow slit, and inside them was a strange flicker of awareness that didn't match his collapsing body, like a wounded animal that still knew where the exit was. Brooke reached for his wrist to brace herself, and felt her skin prickle. The chain had bitten deep into a ring of purple bruising. The skin split at the edge as if it had been yanked again and again, and on the inside of his wrist there was a thin, straight cut. Not the kind made by rubbing, but a knife mark, the kind of cut meant to remind someone they could go deeper anytime they wanted. Brooke understood at once this wasn't the blow of an angry man. This was an interrogation, a warning written into flesh, and the thought made nausea rise in her throat, but she didn't let herself stop. She moved the blade down to the rope at his waist, cut faster, breathing through her teeth, forcing her mind to hold on to one single thing: free him from that post before the headlights swept back, before that engine came closer. Eli suddenly grabbed her sleeve, his eyes wide as if he'd heard something, and Brooke heard it too at once, so clear it raised every hair on her neck. Tires grinding on gravel along the path outside, then the engine dropping into a softer rumble like the vehicle was stopping, followed by a short, suffocating silence, and then the dry, precise click of a car door shutting, like a period at the end of a sentence. Brooke immediately cut her breathing down and signaled Eli to be silent, and both of them stood frozen for seconds, their hearts pounding like they wanted out of their chests, the sound so loud Brooke feared someone else could hear it. The man seemed to sense the danger too, his body tightening for a moment, then sagging again with exhaustion. But his lips still forced out a broken whisper like a curse. "Don't call." Brooke didn't answer. She only leaned close to Eli's ear and spoke without sound, yet sharp enough to cut. "When I pull, you go first. You go exactly where I tell you. You don't cry. You don't call out. Do you understand?" Eli swallowed so hard his throat bobbed, then nodded, his small hand squeezing the flashlight like it was the only weapon he had. Brooke turned back to the last rope, drove the blade in, sawed hard, strand after strand snapping, and right then the headlights swept through the trees again, not shining straight on them but enough to stretch the shadows long like claws. Brooke jerked and hauled the man free of the post. He collapsed against her shoulder and nearly took her down, but Brooke held. She hooked his arm over her shoulder, used her body as a brace, and dragged him backward into thick ferns and behind a fallen tree laid crosswise like a natural wall. Eli hurried after her on small, fast steps, the flashlight now aimed only at the ground, just enough to see their footing without throwing light far, and every step felt like it was crushing fear that cracked underfoot. The moment they got the man fully out of the clearing, Brooke forced him down behind the fallen trunk, and in a pure reflex, she clamped her hand over Eli's mouth because she heard footsteps. Not rushed, not stumbling, but steady, certain, like someone who already knew exactly where he was going. A shadow appeared at the edge of the clearing, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a cap or a hood, his face hidden, only the ease of his stride visible, terrifyingly unhurried, as if this ground belonged to him. He stood and stared at the bare post and the ropes that had been cut, silent for so long, Brooke thought she might pass out from not breathing. Then he crouched and touched the drag mark in the soil, lifted a frayed strand of rope between two fingers, held it up in the dim light as if inspecting it, and Brooke understood he hadn't come back just to see whether the victim was dead. He'd come back to check for interference, to track, to finish unfinished work in his own way. In that instant, Brooke saw the difference between a scuffle and a hunt, between violence that explodes and a sentence that's been decided in advance, and she knew one thing with ice sliding through her heart: that man was supposed to die here, according to someone's plan, and she and Eli had just stepped into the story as errors the hunter wouldn't allow to exist for long. Brooke kept her hand clamped over Eli's mouth until the shadowy figure disappeared from the clearing and the sound of footsteps faded toward the trail. Only then did she allow herself a short breath, like someone breaking the surface of water, but she didn't let relief settle in, because she knew that if he came back one more time, or noticed the small prints Eli had left in the damp leaves, everything would end right there. She bent close to her son's ear and whispered as if pressing her own fear down inside. "Now you do exactly what I told you. You go first. Don't look back. You hear me?" Then she slipped her shoulder beneath the man's arm and dragged him inch by inch along the fallen trunk and through the ferns, every centimeter a battle. Her shirt smeared with mud and pine sap, her hands scraped raw against bark, the man's body sagging like a heavy sack of sand. But Brooke didn't let go, because in her mind she could still see that figure examining the rope, as if checking on misplaced property. They edged out of the tree line, crossed a shallow drainage ditch, and only when she saw the county road in the distance did Brooke feel that her legs still belonged to her, that they hadn't broken beneath the weight. She didn't call 911, not because she didn't know it was the proper thing to do, but because she'd seen how cold the system could be with people like her, a single mother living on the edge. One wrong report was enough to turn her into a risk, enough for someone to knock on her door and take her child away. And there was another reason that dried her throat. The man had begged, "Don't call the police," in the voice of someone who knew exactly who would show up, who knew exactly what trap would snap shut. Brooke chose to break the rule in order to do what was right for her son. She dragged the man to the roadside, waited for a gap in traffic, then maneuvered him into her old car, the one she called the old horse, because it wheezed like it might stall every time the air turned cold. Eli climbed into the back seat, pale, clutching his worn teddy bear, his eyes fixed on the rear window as if he expected that shadow to rise again from the trees, while Brooke started the engine and rolled forward slowly, keeping the headlights low, taking back streets with fewer houses, as though she were hiding from her own town. The man lay slumped in the passenger seat, head down, breath heavy and ragged, his body jerking now and then, as pain dragged him up to the surface and dropped him again. Brooke glanced at the dark stain spreading through his black coat and felt time slipping faster than she could control. The motel where she worked sat at the edge of town, its old sign flickering half-lit, half-dead, the kind of cheap glow that made travelers believe they'd only stay one night and forget. But to Brooke it was the one place she knew by heart. Every blind corner, every camera, every exit. She drove around back where a low concrete wall shielded the lot from the main road, parked close to the service door in the blind spot of a camera she'd reported broken months ago, and the owner never fixed. Eli, open the storage door and grab the old blanket from the cabinet. Quick, Brooke ordered in a voice that trembled but didn't waver, and Eli obeyed at once, hopping out and hurrying like a child, trying to grow up in a day that had no room left for childhood. Brooke opened the passenger door and hauled the man out, her back screaming, but she forced herself to brace him, his arm over her shoulder, step by step dragging him into the last empty room she used for laundry overflow. The smell of bleach and damp towels rose sharp enough to make her cough, but she bit it back, shoved the door closed, lowered the man onto the old mattress, and pressed gauze to the worst of the bleeding. Eli ran in with the blanket, breathless, staring at the man and then at his mother, fear and pity mixed in his eyes, as if that dull stare from the forest had followed him here. Brooke pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Her thumb hovered over 911, her heart tightening like a rope, and then she tapped another name, Paige Lawson. Paige was the only person Brooke trusted to help without turning the story into a report, a file, an accusation. Paige answered almost immediately, her voice rough from just finishing a shift. Brooke, what's going on? Brooke spoke fast and low, like whispering inside a church. I need you, right now. I have someone badly hurt. I can't call an ambulance. There was a beat of silence, and then Paige replied with simple certainty. Send the address. I'm coming. When Paige arrived, she wore a heavy coat over her scrubs, her hair tied back in haste, her eyes sharp with the experience of someone used to blood, but even she paused when she saw the man on the bed, face bruised, lips split, chest rising as if it might fail, and the marks on his wrists that didn't look accidental. Paige pulled on gloves, opened her compact kit, checked his pulse, shone a light into his eyes, lifted his lids, then looked at Brooke in a way that needed no words. This wasn't a bar fight. Paige examined the cut on his scalp, the bruising along his ribs, the soaked fabric, and lowered her voice, steady and certain. This is targeted. This is interrogation. He was meant to be finished, not knocked down. Brooke felt those words like ice sliding through her insides, like the shadow in the forest standing behind her again. Paige worked to stop the bleeding, cleaned wounds, stitched quickly with the practiced hands of someone who had held lives together in emergency rooms. While Brooke held the light and pressed gauze, Eli standing at the foot of the bed clutching his teddy bear, watching every stitch as if afraid the man would vanish if he blinked. Paige glanced at Eli and softened her tone. Sweetheart, can you step outside for a minute? Eli shook his head hard, his grip tightening around the bear, and Brooke understood her son was keeping a silent promise not to walk away. As Paige leaned over, Brooke noticed something small bulging near the edge of the man's coat, like an object shoved in haste, and before she could speak, Paige gave a quiet warning. Brooke, if he vomits or stops breathing, call me immediately, and whatever you do, don't bring the police here. Whoever did this is still looking. Brooke nodded, her throat tight, because that was exactly what she feared. And in that moment, while Brooke turned to grab more towels, Eli quietly picked up the small plastic-wrapped item his mother had pulled from the man's coat and set on the table. He looked at it like it was a dangerous insect, then glanced at his mother busy at the sink, at Paige stitching, and with the instinct of a child who understood someone had been searching for this, Eli slipped the object into the seam along the back of his teddy bear, his fingers clumsy but determined, then hugged the bear to his chest, as if holding a secret heavier than 8 years old. Paige had just tied off the final knot when a deep, Muted vibration pulsed through the room like a foreign heartbeat. Not from Brooke's phone or pages, but from the man lying on the bed itself. Short, sharp, repeating in a pattern Brooke had never heard from any device in her life. Like a coded call meant for exactly one person to understand. Brooke froze, her eyes snapping to the black coat draped over the chair back, where a tiny device lit up and went dark again, its cold glow like a fish's eye. Paige glanced once, and her face changed instantly, no longer the focused calm of a nurse, but the alertness of someone who knew what had just buzzed wasn't a medication reminder. "Brooke, don't touch it," Paige said quietly. But it was too late. The man stirred, his chest lifting as if someone had hauled him up from the bottom of a ravine. His eyes opening, and this time they weren't fully glazed. There was a frightening edge of awareness in them, as though he'd heard an alarm only he could recognize. The device vibrated again, then a soft chime flicked on, not loud, but enough to raise gooseflesh on Brooke's arms. The man tried to lift his hand, the bruised wrist shaking, his fingers searching as if feeling for the way home, and he rasped out one broken word that sounded like an order. "Give it." Paige hesitated for a single beat, then picked up the device and held it close to his ear so he wouldn't have to move. But the instant Paige touched it, another sound rose in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, steady. Not the stagger of a drunk motel guest, but the weight of someone moving with purpose. Brooke felt the blood in her body turn cold, because she knew the hunters tonight weren't just one, and she couldn't tell who had come to rescue and who had come to kill. She pulled Eli back and tucked him into the corner near the closet. Eli's eyes wide, his face gone white. Yet he didn't cry. He only hugged his teddy bear tight like a shield. Paige shot Brooke a look, lips pressed, one hand still holding the device to the man's ear. And Brooke moved in front of her son by instinct, shoulders tight, as if her thin body could become a wall. The knock on the door wasn't frantic, just 3 even, cold taps, and then a man's low voice carried through. "Open up." Brooke didn't answer. She backed up one step and grabbed the mop handle, leaning against the wall as if it were a weapon. And in her mind, she saw the figure at the forest edge, touching the cut rope, and she felt herself standing at the exact point where every mistake gets erased. Paige set the device down on the table, looked at the wounded man, then at Brooke, her whisper edged with urgency. "If these are his people, they'll get in no matter what. But if they're not, then—" Paige didn't finish, because the lock made a soft click. Someone outside was testing it with a key. Brooke's panic spiked so hard she thought her heart might burst, but she clenched her teeth and lunged forward to slide the deadbolt. And in that same moment, the door slammed under a hard shove, not breaking, but trembling like it might. Brooke lifted the mop handle, her voice raw. "Get out of here. I'm calling the police." The threat sounded thin even in her own ears, because she still hadn't called anyone. The door flew open, and a tall man stepped in like a dark shape, cutting the room's dim light in half, wearing a dark coat with the collar up, his gaze sweeping quick as a blade, and right behind him were 2 others, angled slightly, hands hovering near their belts like men who were used to reaching for something that shouldn't be drawn in front of innocent people. Brooke moved fully in front of Eli at once, the mop handle trembling in her grip but still aimed straight. And in that moment, she saw the eyes of the man who'd entered. No drunkenness, no confusion, only the cold steadiness of discipline. "I said get out," Brooke repeated, this time almost shouting. Paige rose too, one hand lifted as if to shield, but the man didn't look at Brooke for long. He looked straight to the bed, to the injured man, and his voice dropped, not pleading but confirming. "Boss." The word landed like a stone, making the room feel heavier. The man on the bed drew in, breath hissing, then forced his head up, his eyes locking onto the silhouette by the door. And for the first time Brooke heard something in his voice that wasn't pain but power pressed down under blood. "Klein." The man at the door didn't react like someone hearing his name. He reacted like a soldier receiving an order, stepping forward 1 pace, then stopping when he saw Brooke in the way, his eyes sliding over Eli for a brief moment, cold but not cruel, and he said, very short, "I'm not here to hurt you." Brooke let out a dry laugh that came from fear. "I've got no reason to believe that." And the 2 behind Klein shifted slightly, their hands dropping lower, and Brooke felt cold sweat trail down her spine, ready to scream. But at that exact moment the man on the bed surged halfway up, a groan tearing out like it ripped his lungs, and he spoke louder, clearer, as if stamping the air with authority. "Hands down. The order wasn't for Brooke, it was for the men behind Klein. And strangely, they froze at once, as if there was still an order in this room no one dared break. Klein tilted his head, voice low. "Boss, you're alive." The man breathed hard, then looked at Brooke, his gaze settling on the mud on her shirt, on her scraped hands, on Eli clutching the teddy bear, and he rasped, each word dragged up from stone. "You pulled me off that post." Brooke didn't answer, she only stared, and he continued, like a truth that couldn't be taken back. "You saved my life." Paige stood rigid beside her, face tight, and Brooke felt as if those words had just pulled her into something she could no longer outrun. Klein stepped closer, reaching as if to touch the injured man, but the man raised a hand to stop him, eyes never leaving Brooke. And then he spoke, this time giving a real name, as if deciding to shed the last layer of cover. "I'm Gideon Vale." The name fell like thunder in a small town, and even though Brooke had never met him, she could feel the weight it carried, like a door swinging open into a darker place. Gideon swallowed with difficulty and went on, weak but sharp. "I was betrayed." Klein's jaw tightened. "Caleb." Gideon gave a small nod, small enough that fresh blood beaded at his lip. "Caleb Sutter." Brooke heard the name like the outline of a man she'd never seen but already felt, and in her mind flashed the smell of gasoline, the sweep of headlights, the clean-cut rope. Klein turned to the two behind him and signaled, and they spread out like shadows, checking the window, the hall, while Brooke still stood in front of Eli, because she didn't dare trust anyone, not even the man who'd just said she'd saved his life. Gideon saw the mop handle in Brooke's hands. The corner of his mouth twitched as if he might smile but didn't have the strength, and he breathed out a sentence that sounded like a heavy promise. "No one touches the boy." Eli looked up at Gideon, his eyes bright with fear threaded through curiosity, and Brooke didn't know why that single line made her want to believe and run at the same time. Outside in the back lot, a strange car sat crooked in the darkness, windows tinted like closed eyes. A man inside lifted his phone, snapped a quick photo of the last empty room at the end of the row the moment Klein stepped in. Then his thumb tapped out a message and sent it without hesitation. "They've found the witness." And when the screen went dark, the car rolled away silently, carrying the truth that from this moment on, Brooke and Eli weren't outsiders anymore. On the other side of town, inside a warehouse converted into a makeshift office that looked from the outside like an old machine repair shop, Caleb Sutter sat so still he seemed not to breathe, the cold fluorescent light carving his cheekbones into something sharp as a blade. On the table lay a phone that had just received a message with a photo of the motel room door, and Caleb didn't need to ask a single question to know Gideon Vale had survived, because only the living could make Klein show up in person. He picked up his lighter, flicked it once as if testing it, then set it down again, his gray eyes moving over the men gathered around him, with a calm so frightening it felt unnatural, the calm of someone who'd mapped every escape route before ever pulling a trigger. A younger man swallowed and stammered that someone confirmed the boss was still breathing, that there was a woman and a boy, that the motel sat on the edge of Pine Hollow, but Caleb raised one finger, and the man went silent, as if a hand had closed around his throat. Caleb didn't like noise. He liked rhythm. He tilted his head and said one dry English word. "One," then stopped, looking at each face as if counting their fear. "Two," stopped again, and when he said 3, the whole room seemed to shrink, because everyone knew that after the third beat, someone's hands would have to get dirty. That counting ritual was Caleb's signature, the thing he used to turn murder into a cold kind of prayer, and his men feared him not because he shouted, but because he didn't have to. "Gideon didn't die," Caleb said, his voice as light as if he were confirming an appointment. "And if Gideon lives, he'll come back to take what's his, and he'll need witnesses to clean up the story." He tapped the photo again, zoomed in on the motel doorway, and smiled without warmth. "A single mother and a kid. She doesn't know what she's just done." One of the men asked softly if they should finish the witnesses to cut the trail, and Caleb looked at him the way you look at a fly, then began to count again. 1, 2, 3, and the moment 3 fell from his mouth, the man turned pale, understanding that simple thought was the dumbest mistake he could have made. "No," Caleb said. "Kill them too fast, and they're just another body, and Gideon can still rebuild another way. I want her alive long enough to become the noose that closes around Gideon's throat." He rolled the lighter between his fingers, the flame reflecting in his eyes like 2 coals. "She'll be a criminal, a kidnapper, someone hiding a man, someone holding contraband. And once it's written into a file, if Gideon jumps in to save her, he's only saving someone the law already has a name for, and he'll get dragged into the mud the exact way I want. Caleb leaned forward, his voice slow, like a plan he'd memorized years ago. They would steer the story toward violence, drugs, organizations. They would make the whole town see Brooke as the source of danger. And most of all, they would use someone the law trusted to stamp it all as true. Sheriff Frank Hargrove, Caleb said, like he was naming a tool. He'll do his part. The men glanced at one another, knowing the sheriff was the power in Pine Hollow, but Caleb didn't need to persuade anyone, because he'd already paid the price. He gestured and a thin bag was placed on the table. Inside it, a thick envelope and an expensive watch. And Caleb spoke as casually as if he were talking about the weather. Frank likes things that help him forget he's just a keeper of order in a small town. He leaned in, voice lowered as if murmuring into the ear of every man nearby. Frank would file a report about violence at the forest edge. He'd tie it to the easiest story people believed: drugs. He'd open an investigation broad enough to pull everyone into it, and once Brooke's name appeared, other agencies would follow their own momentum, without Caleb having to touch a thing. Caleb stood, buttoned his coat, his eyes moving down a list of potential risks, and he stopped on another name: Paige Lawson. "A nurse," he said, and then he counted again. 1, 2, 3. As if Paige's fate had been fixed the moment he spoke her name. She saw the injuries. She knows this isn't an accident, and she could talk if fear makes her crack. Caleb ordered them to watch Paige from the hospital, not to kill her yet, but to make her feel eyes on her, to make her hesitate every time she considered opening her mouth, to choke the truth in its own throat before it ever became words. At the same time, back at the motel, Gideon was still weak, but his gaze had sharpened again. Klein said they had to move the boss immediately before the hunters returned, but Brooke couldn't take in the whole sentence, because in her head there was only one simple, ruthless reality. A name had just been spoken in her room, and that name was pulling a storm straight toward her and her son. Paige packed up her supplies, gave short instructions like someone who'd just crossed a line and understood the consequences, then left through the back. But when she later stepped out into the hospital parking lot to grab something for her next shift, she saw a black car sitting far off, no front plate, windows tinted dark, and when she changed direction, the car changed too, not rushing, not crowding, just close enough to remind her she was being followed. Brooke started seeing the same thing that afternoon. When she took Eli home to grab a few necessities and drove back to the motel, a strange vehicle kept appearing at the edge of her rearview mirror, keeping distance like a hunter patient enough not to spook prey into bolting the wrong way. Sometimes disappearing behind a bend, and then returning on the next straightaway as if it knew where she was going before she did. Eli sat in back, holding his teddy bear, saying little, but those child eyes stared through the glass like he could see the dark shape clinging to them, and Brooke felt herself being forced into a tunnel with darkness at both ends. One end was the law that could take her child on a single accusation, the other was an underworld that could erase her, because she'd saved the wrong man, and in the middle was the cold whisper of a man named Caleb, a man who hadn't shown his face yet, but had already begun to count. The next morning, Pine Hollow woke up with an odd feeling in the air, the kind you get before a storm. Not because clouds were rolling in, but because patrol cars were parked across the entrance to the forest edge, yellow tape stretched tight like a declaration that the place now belonged to the law's story. No longer the woods where children gathered pine cones. Sheriff Frank Hargrove stood at the scene in a heavy coat, hands in his pockets, his voice carrying clearly as he directed his deputies to set up a perimeter, document, photograph, and what was frightening was the way he chose his words. He didn't say a man had been assaulted. He didn't say there was a victim. He said, an incident involving violence with possible drug involvement, as if slipping those two words into the air was enough to make the town's eyes shift from pity to fear. Frank had them comb the clearing, bag the cut rope, measure the muddy tire tracks, point at the drag mark, and tell his second to write possible transport of contraband. And in that moment, Brooke's truth began to fracture at the very first line of the report. Rumors ran faster than any vehicle. Before noon, people were whispering in the diner that an out-of-town crew had brought product into the woods. There'd been a fight. Someone died. Someone fled. And those stories didn't need evidence. All they needed was a sheriff with a confident voice for them to become everybody knows. Frank wasn't stupid. He understood that managing fear was the cheapest way to manage a crowd. Because once people were afraid, they would censor themselves, keep their distance, close their mouths, watch one another with suspicion. And they wouldn't notice the hand rewriting the truth behind the scenes. Frank called in tech to pull road camera data, demanded a dump of vehicles moving along the county road near the forest edge, and at the same time, he sent someone to the motel with harmless-sounding questions about an old car driven by a woman who worked nights. The motel owner didn't need long to say Brooke's name, not out of cruelty, just out of fear of hassle, and because in a small town a poor single mother is always the easiest answer to any trouble. By early afternoon, the name Brooke Whitman was already on Frank's desk in a brand new folder, not even thick yet, but heavy as stone because it had been stamped with prejudice. Paige Lawson hadn't even slept after her shift when she got a call inviting her to cooperate at the sheriff's office. The reason sounded procedural enough: a report that a medical worker had practiced outside her scope, stitched without authorization, concealed a serious injury. Paige knew immediately it was a trap, because there was only one place she'd done that, and only one reason anyone would know that fast. But she still had to go, because if she refused, they'd turn her into someone running from guilt. When Paige sat under fluorescent lights in the interview room, Frank didn't shout. He asked questions in a tone so polite it was cold. Where was she last night? Why was she at the motel? Why hadn't she reported it? Did she know the law? And every question tightened like a cord around her throat, not to find the truth, but to create a sentence in a transcript that could be used later. Paige noticed a young deputy standing in the corner. The name on his badge read Owen Mercer, his face still young, but his eyes not entirely blank. Owen handed Paige a cup of water, and that small motion told Paige there was still a person in this room. Only that person was trapped inside a uniform. In the neighborhood where Brooke lived, people's eyes began to change color. The neighbor who used to greet her by the backyard now looked at her like she was a nest of fire ants. The man who once fixed her porch roof now pulled his own child inside when he saw Eli step out. Brooke walked through the post office to pick up mail and felt like she was moving down a hallway made of ears, where every whisper could become an accusation. She kept Eli close, tried to make her son smile like normal, but Eli didn't smile wide anymore. He held his teddy bear in silence, his gaze flicking down the street as if watching for a black car that could appear at any moment. Back at the motel, Gideon Vale lay propped up, his face still pale from blood loss, but his voice had grown steadier, and that steadiness didn't come from health. It came from the power he'd always carried. Klein had built a ring of defense around the area, someone watching the end of the row, someone watching the parking lot, as if the motel had turned into a temporary fortress, and Gideon looked at Brooke with eyes that didn't allow detours. "You and the boy need to disappear," he said. "I've got a safe place." Brooke let out a dry laugh, not because it was funny, but because the desperation in her had been pushed to the edge. "Safe how?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "If I go there, do I still get to work? Do I still get to take my kid to school? Or do I become someone locked in a house where I don't know the address? I don't know the way out." Gideon went quiet for a beat, as if for the first time he had to look at the problem through the eyes of someone who didn't live with choices. "I'm not locking you up," he said. But Brooke shook her head, her eyes red, no tears falling. "You don't have to lock me up. If you put a man outside the door, I'm not free anymore." She'd lived too long with other people deciding her fate. Landlords, motel owners, bills, night shifts, and the thought of trading one kind of captivity for another, just to outrun danger, made her feel like she couldn't breathe. In the sheriff's office, Owen Mercer flipped through the report labeled drug-related violence and saw the places where it bent away from procedure, the way Frank's language pushed the story toward a conclusion already chosen, the way the camera request was too broad, the way the motel became a target too quickly. And Owen's young professional instinct pricked like a needle. Someone was setting this up, but Owen also knew he was a new deputy. One protest in the wrong place could get him shoved out of the department, cost him insurance, cost him work, cost him the future, and that fear kept him silent, the same way the whole town was silent under the sheriff's voice. Brooke looked at Gideon and spoke her last sentence like sliding a bolt into place. "I'm not going with you somewhere I can't control. I just want my boy safe, and my life not erased from the map." And as she said it, she didn't know whether she was refusing a gilded cage or refusing her only chance to survive. She only knew an invisible hand was writing her name into a file, stamping it "Mother endangering her child," and every second she hesitated was another second that stamp pressed deeper. The emergency meeting at town hall happened so fast, Brooke felt as if the town had been keeping a stage ready to hang her from all along, waiting for Sheriff Frank to snap his fingers so the lights would come on, and the crowd would slide into their parts without being told. She came because she didn't have a choice, because the whispers around her house had turned into open stairs, because patrol cars kept cruising past her door like they were counting beats, and because Eli had started asking in a small voice whether they were going to be arrested, asking with a tone that tried to sound grown up and still couldn't hide the tremble underneath. The old town hall creaked with every step. The fluorescent lights washed everyone's skin pale, and the packed air carried the smell of fear, thick as an invisible smoke. Brooke walked in holding Eli's hand, and it felt like hundreds of eyes swung toward her at once, like compass needles snapping to a magnet. Some people stared openly, others pretended to look away while stealing quick glances like disaster could spread by sight. The whispers hit her ears in a blur. Drugs, violence, motel, kid. And then a woman in the front row spoke loudly enough for others to hear. Not like she was speaking to Brooke, but like she was speaking to the whole room, saying when children get mixed into this, who takes responsibility? Brooke wanted to answer, wanted to shout that her son was only gathering pine cones and heard a groan, that her son had done the kindest thing the adults in this town hadn't done, but her throat seized, because here, truth didn't arrive before fear. Fear arrived first and dragged everything behind it. Sheriff Frank stood at the podium wearing the solemn face of a man protecting order, talking about community safety, talking about threats from outside town, talking about cooperating and reporting anything suspicious, and every sentence had a clean, polished surface, but Brooke could hear the point hidden underneath, aimed straight at her. When Frank mentioned the motel area and unusual activity, several heads turned immediately toward Brooke, as if her name had already been written on a board no one dared read out loud. Eli squeezed her hand tighter, his small palm ice cold, and Brooke bent down and whispered for him to stand still and say nothing. But she knew that in the eyes of frightened people, silence could look like guilt. Then the back door of the meeting room opened, not with a slam, but with enough weight to change the rhythm of the whole space, as if a cold draft had entered. Brooke turned and saw a group walk in with a presence that didn't belong to Pine Hollow. Dark coats, a calm, controlled stride that didn't look like neighbors coming to listen. It looked like people arriving to reclaim what was theirs. In the middle of them was a tall man, with bruises still visible, and a thin stitched line along his eyebrow, but eyes so sharp the crowd parted to make a path without anyone having to ask. Beside him walked a man in a neat suit, carrying a portfolio, the posture of an attorney used to stepping into rooms where every word has a price. Brooke felt her heart drop, because she knew at once that wherever Gideon Vale stood, whatever he wore, the air around him carried a mark, dangerous, and ruled by its own order. Frank paused for a beat too, then recovered fast into a smile that was just polite enough, as if he were greeting a donor instead of a man the law had reason to treat carefully. The whole town hall began to buzz like a stirred-up hive, people whispering names, asking who he was, why he was here, whether this was the gang everyone was talking about, whether the town was about to be dragged into a war. Brooke stood pinned between two currents of attention, one from townspeople hunting for a scapegoat, the other from the men with Gideon watching her like a weakness that could be used. And she wanted to disappear, but Eli at her side made that impossible. Gideon didn't waste time scanning the room. He moved straight to the front, stopped at a distance that couldn't be called disruption, and his attorney requested the floor in proper order, voice clear and even, stating that his client was the victim of a severe assault, that evidence suggested the incident involved an organized act of violence, and that baseless rumors were endangering a witness and a child. That last line made people flinch, because they hadn't expected the word witness to mean a child, and they hadn't expected the child to be standing right here. Gideon stepped forward one pace. He didn't hold the microphone long. He spoke only a few sentences, cold and exact, the way a man used to giving orders, forcing himself to speak in the language of procedure. He said Brooke Whitman was the person who had pulled him back from death, that she wasn't a criminal, that she was a lifesaver, and he demanded the town and law enforcement protect her under witness protection protocols, because any leak could lead to deadly consequences. The way he said under protocol sounded strange in town hall, like a wild animal wearing a suit, and it didn't calm people. It frightened them more, because they could hear he knew the law well enough to use it like a blade. Frank seized that moment, the way you seize a match in a room full of gasoline. He stepped up, his voice rising. stressing that an individual connected to dangerous elements had appeared in the middle of a community meeting, that this was a sign the town was becoming a hot spot, and that he had to prioritize children's safety. He never said outright what Gideon was, but he suggested enough for people to imagine worse. Then he turned toward Brooke with a look of manufactured sympathy and said she had the right to remain silent, but she also had a responsibility to explain why she was connected to this man, why she brought a stranger to the motel, why she didn't report it immediately. Brooke opened her mouth, but the noise swallowed her. Objections, accusations, questions coming fast like stones thrown at someone without a shield. Eli clung to his mother's shirt, his eyes red but dry. He looked from Gideon to Frank, as if trying to understand how adults could turn kindness into a crime. And just as the room felt close to breaking into chaos, the side door opened, and two women in official coats walked in, name badges and lanyards catching the light. And they didn't need a long introduction for Brooke's skin to go cold, because anyone who's ever been poor knows what kind of power those women carry, the power to take the most precious thing away. One of them spoke in a short, practiced tone, saying they were from Child Protective Services, that they'd received a report involving a serious violent incident and a risk to a child's safety, and that they were notifying the room they would be conducting an emergency assessment of the Whitman family. The room fell silent for a strange beat. Then the murmurs surged again, and this time they weren't aimed at Brooke as a troublemaker. They were aimed at Brooke as a mother who could lose the right to be a mother. Brooke felt her knees go soft, but she didn't fall, because Eli was holding on to her like she was the last solid ground. And in the noise rising again, she heard Gideon say very quietly, almost only for her, that this had been set up, while Frank watched them with calm eyes like a stamp had already come down, and Brooke understood the meeting had never been about protecting the town. It had been about making it official to turn her into the problem that needed to be removed. CPS didn't come to ask questions or listen. They came with a decision already poured into shape inside a file that Sheriff Frank set on the table like a sentence. And the moment the woman with the official badge used the phrase, "emergency hold due to safety risk," Brooke felt the wooden floor of Town Hall tilt beneath her. Every sound around her seemed to drift far away, leaving only the wild pounding of her own heart and Eli's breathing close against her side. No, please, I didn't do anything wrong," Brooke blurted, her voice cracking like someone was squeezing her throat, her hand crushing her son's so tightly both their fingers went white, as if letting go for even a second would give the world permission to rip Eli away. The CPS worker said they were acting on reports from law enforcement and community sources, that there had been a serious, violent incident linked to organized crime, that the child had been near the scene and was now in an unsafe environment, that under procedure they had authority to place an emergency hold for assessment. Procedure. The word landed like a hammer striking Brooke's head over and over, because she knew procedure is always harsher than truth for people who are poor. And once you're labeled a risk, you can spend your whole life trying to peel it off. Frank stood nearby, his face still carved into official seriousness, but there was a cold satisfaction at the corner of his mouth, like a man who'd just moved the right piece on the board. The townspeople watched Brooke with a mix of pity and cruel relief, as if they'd just been handed a name for the disaster, and felt safe because it was being handled. Brooke searched the room for a kind face, for someone who'd once greeted her outside the post office, someone who'd asked how Eli was doing in school. But those faces slid away, avoided her, because when a system starts swallowing someone, a crowd usually steps back so it doesn't get splashed. "I'm his mother," Brooke said, her voice rough. "I take care of him. I raise him. I work night shifts so he can eat. You can't take my child because of rumors." The CPS woman held Brooke's gaze, not cruel, not soft, and said Brooke would have the right to appeal later, that they needed cooperation right now to avoid escalation. And two other staff members stepped closer, creating a space so small yet so final. It turned Brooke into an outsider to the child she was still holding. Eli looked up at his mother, eyes swollen red but trying to stay steady the way she'd told him at the forest edge. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, then swallowed it down, because children understand by instinct that if they cry too loud, adults will see them as weaker. Brooke felt her throat tear as she begged, not the pretty kind of begging, but the bare kind that comes from a mother who fears losing her child more than dying. She said she would show up to every meeting, provide every document, take every test, sign anything, just please don't separate them right now. But CPS didn't change course, and Frank didn't give her time either. He lifted his hand and signaled for the deputy nearby to keep order, and Brooke saw Owen Mercer standing there, his face tight like a man being pulled in two directions, his eyes flicking to Eli and then to the file, like he wanted to say he was sorry and didn't dare. Gideon Vale stood toward the front, his tall frame like a cold shadow, the bruises on his face making him look even more dangerous in the townspeople's eyes. And Brooke saw his hand curl into a fist, his jaw lock, his gaze darken like a tunnel mouth opening. Klein and his men shifted forward by one step, not to speak, but to act. And Brooke understood at once the world Gideon carried had its own way of solving problems. Fast, clean, final, the kind where one order would make Frank disappear from their lives. Brooke snapped toward Gideon, her words coming out sharp as a blade even as tears flooded her eyes. "No, don't do that." Gideon stared like he couldn't believe her. Brooke shook her head hard. "I'm not saving my son with blood. I'm saving my son with the truth. If you do it your way, they'll say I conspired. They'll use it to keep my child forever." Her words hit like a lock thrown across the doorway to violence, and for one beat Gideon went still, not because he'd gone soft, but because he heard the most dangerous thing of all, that Caleb and Frank wanted Brooke cornered precisely to force him into the wrong move. "Brooke," Gideon said very low, holding each word between his teeth, "they're taking your child." Brooke met his eyes, tears falling, her voice not breaking. "Then we take him back with evidence, not with bodies." The sentence settled like a leash of discipline around the beast that was rising inside Gideon, leaving him no choice but to watch as Eli was pulled away without shattering the room that instant. A CPS worker bent down to say something to Eli, then gently but firmly guided him out of his mother's grasp. Brooke clawed at her son's shirt like she was grabbing the last living part of herself. Her scream tore through town hall and made a few people flinch and look away. "Eli, look at me, look at me. I'm here. I'm not leaving you." But Eli's small hand slipped free of hers, cold as water. And in the moment that empty space opened, Brooke felt as if her heart had been hooked out and dropped onto the floor. Eli was led toward the door. He looked back only once, and in a final, desperate motion, he shoved his worn teddy bear into Brooke's arms, along with a tiny folded scrap of paper tucked into its fur, whispering, "Hold him for me, Mom," before he was pulled away into the hallway. Then he kept walking, his face calm in a way that hurt to see. Brooke didn't understand yet. She was still reeling, but Owen Mercer saw that motion, so small, yet enough to make him pause, enough to strike his conscience like a blow. Owen looked at Brooke, then at Frank, then at Eli being taken away like an item that needed sealing, and a crack ran down the length of his fear, because he realized this wasn't ordinary procedure anymore. This was a planned hunt, and that child had just left bait the way adults never think to. Brooke's hand shook as she reached into her pocket and unfolded the paper with fingers that wouldn't obey. Eli's messy handwriting appeared like a life-saving whisper. "The teddy bear has a secret. Don't trust anyone. Remember the gasoline smell." Brooke finished reading and felt her breath vanish. Then she lifted her eyes to the door, where Eli had disappeared, and under the white lights of Town Hall, surrounded by murmurs and the scratch of pens from people who lived by files, she understood her son hadn't only been taken from her. He'd just given her the key to bring him home, and from this moment on, if she collapsed, they would win, and if she stood up, the fight would begin. The county's temporary child-holding facility didn't look like a jail, but it didn't look like a home either. It looked like a room painted in soft colors to hide the truth that this was where children were placed, while adults argued over their fate. The lights stayed bright all day, the disinfectant smell clung to clothes, and the faint click of locked doors was enough to teach a child's heart that freedom was only being borrowed. Eli was led into a small room with bunk beds and a few plastic toys. A staff member told him it was only temporary, that his mother was being assessed, that everything would be fine, but those words slid past like water, because Eli could still hear his mother screaming in Town Hall, could still feel his hand being pulled out of hers. He sat on the edge of the bed, his arms feeling painfully empty without his teddy bear, but he didn't let himself break. He stared at the locked door, knowing that the secret he had just placed in his mother's hands was the only key that could bring them back together. People think kids only know fear, but Eli had learned something else from his mother, that fear doesn't help anyone if you stay still inside it. When the kind social worker with brown hair tied back brought him a cup of milk and colored paper to draw so you won't feel sad, Eli didn't draw a house or a sun. He sat up straight, took a pencil like he was holding a statement. and began drawing a rough map of the Pine Hollow forest edge the way a child who collects pine cones would remember it, the county road running across, the small patch of grass, the trail leading into the trees, the fallen trunk like a barrier, the clearing where the wooden post stood, and then he added something no one had asked him to draw, a long drag mark and muddy tire tracks, and beside them he wrote slowly in block letters the way he'd practiced at school, gasoline smell, and in the corner of the page he drew a black rectangle with no markings, then circled it and wrote, black car no plate. He looked up at the social worker, eyes red but clear, and spoke very softly as if he was afraid the only thing he could still do might be taken away. Ma'am, my mom didn't do anything bad. Bad people are following us. I saw this car, and this smell. Can you give this to someone good? The woman hesitated, because it wasn't every day a child in temporary custody handed her a map like evidence. But the seriousness in Eli's eyes slowed her down, made her look carefully, made her understand this wasn't random scribbling. She asked his name, asked if he was sure. Eli nodded hard, then added one more sentence like a final nail. I don't want my mom to lose me because bad people are lying. The social worker drew a deep breath, folded the paper, said she would put it into the case file, but Eli could tell that wasn't enough. So he added, his voice small but firm, don't give it to Sheriff Frank. That made her startle. Then she looked at Eli like she was looking at a child, trying to knock on the right door inside a building full of wrong ones. And finally she gave a small nod. Not a big promise, just a promise made with her eyes. The paper didn't go straight to Frank. It moved through the system the way right things often have to slip. The social worker passed it to a supervisor who'd worked with police before. That supervisor remembered the young deputy, Owen Mercer, the one who'd stood in town hall pale-faced and couldn't look straight at Eli and Brooke when CPS took the boy away. When Owen received the paper, he stood frozen for several seconds, because the words gasoline smell and black car no plate hit his instinct like a nail, struck every place the report had bent, the way Frank had written the story too fast. Owen held the page, looked at it, then looked toward the sheriff's office door. Fear of losing his job surged, but this time something else surged harder. The sound of a mother screaming, and the look in Eli's eyes when he turned back, and the crack in Owen's silence widened. That night Owen didn't ask permission, didn't file a request. He slipped into the station's computer room, logged in with his own credentials, opened the traffic camera system, his rank usually only accessed with an order, and his hands shook as he typed in the time windows around that morning by the forest edge, searching for vehicles on County Road, searching for a black car with no plate, or at least a vehicle with a plate that couldn't be read. Every time the hallway door creaked, Owen flinched like a thief, but he kept staring at the screen, because for the first time he understood that if he didn't do this, a child would grow up with the lesson that the truth has no one standing on its side. At the same time, back at the motel, Brooke sat down hard on the laundry room floor, like her knees could no longer hold her. Eli's scrap of paper had hurt her, and lit her awake at once, and she looked at the teddy bear in her hands the way you look at a tiny safe. Gideon wanted to move her immediately. Klein wanted every trace wiped, but Brooke said only one sentence, her voice hollow but unbending. I need what's inside the teddy bear. She carefully cut open the seam along the bear's back with small scissors, her heart pounding like it might split, and a tiny nylon-wrapped bundle fell out, sealed tight, like someone had hidden it in order to live. Brooke opened it and found a small micro-SD card and a slim USB adapter, cold against her palm, and she understood why the man in the woods had been searched, understood why Gideon had been marked to be finished, understood why they were being hunted. She called Paige with shaking hands. Paige arrived with dark circles under her eyes and didn't ask much. She only looked at the memory card, then looked at Brooke, and let out a single sentence like she was cursing herself for being right. I knew it. Paige pulled out an old laptop, used a card reader, inserted the micro SD, and a folder appeared on the screen filled with files named like strange codes and a long log of characters, timestamps, containers, destinations. Then Paige opened an audio file, and a man's voice filled the speakers, deep, cold, with the habit of pausing like he was counting before giving an order. And Brooke felt the blood in her body turn to ice, because it wasn't just data. It was the voice of the man who had decided to take her child. And for the first time since all of this began, Brooke had something in her hands the system couldn't easily bend with rumor. Brooke thought the hardest thing to breathe through tonight was the voice inside the audio file. The lines of logs that read like shackles, the empty space where Eli should have been asleep in the small room the two of them shared. But then Gideon Vale said one sentence that bent everything inside her like it had been folded in half. He looked at the micro SD card on the table, looked at Paige trying to pull the important sections from the files, and said with a calm that sounded like he was recalling something long finished, "You need to know one thing, Brooke. I've heard your name for a long time." Brooke lifted her head, eyes raw, voice hard. "I don't know you." Gideon didn't deny it. He only tilted his head, the stitched line on his eyebrow tightening, and his eyes were no longer the eyes of a man who'd just escaped death. They were the eyes of someone who'd stood outside her life for too long. "County Hospital, 2 years ago. Your mother's bill," he said, each word dropping like pebbles, "was paid through an anonymous fund." Brooke went still, because that memory was still a deep cut. The day she carried her mother into the emergency room, heard the doctor say they had to act now, heard the financial office name a number bigger than what she earned in a whole year, and then the next morning they told her it had been covered. They called it a grant, no name attached, like a miracle Brooke had clung to as proof there was still some kindness left in the world. "You," Brooke breathed, then laughed without sound. "You were that miracle." Paige paused too, eyes shifting from the screen to Gideon. And Gideon didn't look proud. He continued like he was confessing something emotionless. "I didn't do it so you'd owe me. I did it because you were in a risk zone." Brooke felt as if cold water had been poured down the back of her neck. "Risk zone for what?" Gideon held her gaze. "Your motel sits on a route Caleb uses to move people and goods. Workers there are easy to pull into things they don't understand. Easy to turn into witnesses, or into bodies to silence them. I once told my people to watch the area to make sure no one touched civilians for no reason." Brooke took a step back like she'd been slapped. "Watch," she repeated, and then her voice broke with anger and hurt. "You mean you put people watching me, watching my son, watching us live, and you call that protection?" Gideon didn't react like a man insulted. He only frowned slightly, as if he'd expected this. "I didn't enter your home. I didn't touch you. I didn't harm you. But you decided for me," Brooke said, sharper now. "You decided who I am inside your story. You decided I needed to be watched. You decided my mother's hospital bill was something you could set on a table and walk away from. You decided my life is a point on your map." Paige started to speak, to soften it, but Brooke lifted a hand to stop her, because what was breaking her wasn't the money. It was the feeling of being seen as a risk label, a poor woman marked for management. Gideon stepped half a pace forward, then stopped, forcing his voice steady. "If I didn't do it, Caleb would've. If my people weren't watching that route, you could have been dragged in sooner. Worse. Then you're the same as him," Brooke said, the words escaping before she could hold them back, and she watched Gideon's eyes darken as if something deep had been touched. "I'm not the same." "You might not be the same," Brooke answered, tears spilling but not softening her voice. "But you're still a man who's used to control. I can't save my son if I let another man control my life, even if that man says he's helping." She turned to Paige, voice hoarse. "I'm not going to a safe house." Paige looked at her with worry, reminding her they were being hunted, that Frank and Caleb would tighten the net, that a safe place might be the only choice left. But Brooke shook her head, her shoulders trembling, her spine straight. "I'm not trading my right to be a mother for a cage. I'm going the legal route. I need the law on my side, because if I don't, they'll use the law to take Eli forever." Gideon stayed silent longer than a beat, as if he were weighing the instinct to protect against the pride of a woman whose boundaries had just been crossed. Then at last he said one short word. "Okay." No pressure, no threat. None of the heavy power Brooke had braced herself to fight. Just one word laid down like a foundation stone. And that lack of force hurt more, because it proved Gideon could choose differently. He'd just chosen control for so long, he'd come to treat it as normal. Brooke turned away, gripping the memory card like a lifeline. And right then her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Paige watched her with caution. Gideon watched too, and Brooke answered with a throat gone dry. A short video appeared on the screen. Harsh white light like a hospital or an office somewhere. Eli sitting in a chair, face pale, eyes red, but lifting his chin toward the camera like he was trying to look straight at his mother. Behind him a blank wall and a man's voice off screen, calm in a way that was terrifying. "Hand over what you have, and the boy will be left alone." Brooke didn't catch the next words because her ears rang, but she heard Eli, very small, trying to stay steady. "Mom, I'm okay. Don't trust." And then the video cut off. A sound tore out of Brooke like an animal cornered. Her whole body wanted to collapse. Paige grabbed her shoulders to hold her up, and Gideon stood still. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck stood out. The message attached was only one short line: "Give the evidence, or lose your child." Brooke looked at Gideon, eyes burning, voice shaking. "You see, this is why I can't let you handle it your way. They want me to react wrong." Gideon looked back, his gaze like heated stone. "I can bring the boy back in one night." Brooke shook her head, tears falling, her words not breaking. "And the next morning they'll say I conspired with the Mafia to kidnap my own child. Frank will sign more papers, CPS will close the case, and Eli will be a child pulled back and forth forever because his mother chose violence instead of truth." Gideon didn't argue.